Welcome to Roots to Innovation, a webcast podcast by Futureproofing Next. Today, we're doing Roots to Innovation, and some of these structures and ventures are not like the other. I'd like to welcome everyone to the webcast, and I'll get started with the program right now. First, we want to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing in the broader community. And one of the things that we have done, Sean Moffitt, my partner in managing and running the sense making of the pandemic and co-creator of Futureproofing Next, we've created something called the Gray Swan Guild. And I'm going to turn it to Sean to explain a little bit about what it's about, and also to talk a little bit about what we would love from the group of people in this community.
Yeah, and just real quickly, I think it is probably appropriate just to, as we're in this time of a pandemic, realize our topic that we're talking about today, Roots to Innovation, may be colored somewhat by people reinventing, how they do business. And with that in mind, we've pulled together a global guild of about 135 people that are trying to make sense of this pandemic for these 5 different facets. And so we're currently in a sprint right now to get a June document out that makes sense of the world. And so I think it's consistent with not only what we're talking about in this webcast and podcast, but also our topic today, which is how do we go about innovating differently in the future?
It's great, and we just put in the chat the link if people would like to be taking part in that survey as well. We're trying to get global reach and insights about what to do post-COVID. So I'd like to introduce Sean Moffitt, and I'm Andrea Cates. Our community organizer is Joanne Lemkuhl, and we are Futureproofing Next today hosting this webcast. The first part is to talk a little bit about the difference between route to market and route to innovation. So Sean, talk a little bit about the numbers behind these concepts.
Yeah, and I'm not too sure if this puts our panelists and ourselves in a bit of a box here, but we're less popular than routes to market. And maybe it's the nomenclature we're using, but I did a quick Google search, and when Google says something, it probably is true. And whereas I think most of people in corporate land, sales, marketers, people that commercialize things, are pretty well knowledgeable of routes to market. Like, how do we go about getting our products to market? And are we direct sellers, or are we going through different channels and middlemen? Routes to innovation, on the other hand, have less search hits. And I think writ large, I think people know that there's a whole bunch of different ways out there, but nobody's really codified, okay, what's the full universe and when to use what kind of route to innovation. So that's one of the inspirations for wanting to have this webcast today.
Well, and I also think we've talked a lot about innovation having come of age, and we'll be talking with 3 panelists today about that, because sometimes people define innovation differently. They might think that they don't need innovation because it's just more ideas. And a lot of our corporate clients, especially in scale up, say the last thing in the world we need is more ideas. And so what a lot of people focus on these days, especially, is delivery. And so they might be looking for what we know and the people today know is actually innovation, but they define it through that notion of route to market. So we're gonna go on record as saying that the new definition of innovation, which at Futureproofing we call innovation plus plus, includes the delivery, includes the payback, includes all of the ways that you can operationalize innovation, and that's the new way of thinking of it. So Sean, back to you.
Well, as is custom on every one of our webcasts, we tend to expose some type of landscape or hero chart that maybe gets people to think a little bit differently about things. All of our panelists and people listening don't have to agree with it, but it does scope out maybe a little bit of the landscape that we're going to cover off today. And I think we've extracted this from a visual from one of our upcoming book, where we look at the 25 kind of different options that you can explore, almost like a bingo card. And on one side, just having more ownership and company control versus being third party and external. And on the other side, having this cascading, rising level of change and innovation objectives. And as you can see, it's like there is a full universe of ways to go about innovation. If you look at the second box, I think for a very large period of time, traditional R&D and product development was viewed as the end all and be all of getting to next in innovation. And as you can see, there is a significantly wider universe of innovation routes that I know our three panelists today are all experts in, probably the entire space, but also probably specialize in certain elements of this chart. So I'm not going to go in great detail here, Andrea, but it is something people always look at and go, okay, great. Can we get that chart again? I need to understand it. Well, we're going to fly right by it. So
yeah, the only part that we would like to add to this is we know that the secret to this is there are many ways to get there, and not doing anything is not one of them. So we'll look forward to the panelists weighing in on some of the ways that have really worked, and that's part of our conversation today.
and then just we usually at least add some fodder, and we may refer back to these as we're interviewing our panelists. High growth innovators tend to have more different routes to market, routes to innovation. See, there I just said it myself, routes to market. So more experienced innovators that are higher growth tend to use a much larger repertoire of different routes to innovation. And in our own research from last year, we looked at I think we showed about 25 to 30 different routes, and these were the top 10. I've color coded them because as you look at it, some of them are very internally focused. 2, 4, and 5 were certainly tended to be more closed and internal. But then you got things like 1, 3, 6, and 10 that were much more shared. And then, 7, 8, 9, a little bit further down the list, were certainly much more open and less closed to the world. So a smattering of different things. I'll be curious to know our panelists today whether they think as an industry we're getting better at a wider berth of innovation routes, or if we're still stuck in the 90s or the 70s or the 50s in our thinking.
One of the things that we think is interesting about all of these kinds of charts is we know that they're dynamic. And so we'll measure something at a single point in time. But in the past, we like to also acknowledge that some things have been more relevant, quite frankly, in the past. And so for this moment, one of the things we'll like to talk about is what's most relevant for this moment. Of course, we'll talk a bit about post-COVID as well, but just in general, when the problem was not enough ideas, then maybe you needed one approach. When the problem was not enough capital at a certain point in the development, you needed another approach. When the problem is not enough outside your industry insights being brought into partnerships and co-creation, you might need something else. So we acknowledge that there are different types of approaches that you use to solve different parts of this innovation equation.
And I think I'll just briefly say that I think we'll probably touch on this in our discussion too. There are different variables attached to different routes to innovation. We've identified 15 here where, and one in particular I find, at least back to my corporate innovation days, do we own, control, and have IP on this thing is always a massive consideration for companies that either may be risk averse or want to own the equity of whatever gets produced afterwards. So my hope is we'll interact about what are some of these variables and whether they're real or not. So Andrea.
Yeah, well, so we'll have 3 expert panelists: David Rasson from ING, who's joining us from Brussels; Chenyang Zhu, who is in Silicon Valley as we speak, but does quite a bit of work. He'll explain globally as well, and has lived in Europe and does work with Asia as well. And David Simoes-Brown, who's joining us from London from 100% Open. And if we need to correct anything about the double click on what you want us to tell, you'll have a chance in just a moment to introduce yourselves with the level of the nuance that you'd like to share with today's future-proofing audience. So Sean, talk a little bit about the pandemic is liberating firms to experiment with radical new ideas, says The Economist.
Yeah, I mean, when it's in The Economist, I guess it is a big topic, isn't it? I ran across this article, and maybe just to get all of our panelists talking up front, I know we're in the stage right now where I'm in my 12th week of no official haircut in the middle of a pandemic, just so we can root ourselves here. I'm looking at both my panelists. They're much more coiffed than I am right now. And we're talking about routes to innovation, which probably has some impact on how we're going about. So maybe I'll ask, and there are 2 Davids. So if I say David, it's going to actually mean both of you guys will talk at the same time. Maybe I'll my Belgium version of David from ING. Maybe you can just chime in terms of, this topic, the pandemic. How might you, briefly be thinking about the world differently on this topic?
Um, well, I think one of the things I was asking myself when this whole thing broke out was how can I be relevant now to my colleagues? Because on the one hand, you have the business continuity, people that were trying to keep the bank up and running, trying to serve their customers with their lending needs. And then still, I think we have a strategy, but all the assumptions underpinning that strategy, yeah, I think there's something of the past. And I think where I try to be relevant for my business units was indeed in revalidating or not the most critical assumptions underpinning their current core accelerator strategy. And I think this is, I think, the sweet spot for corporate innovators in this period to me.
Wonderful. And maybe I'll pivot up to my other David across the channel in London somewhere, I believe. Your kind of approach to this topic now that we're kind of in this the wake of a pandemic.
Well, I think it's pretty early on in the process. I mean, corporate strategies move but slowly. Government strategies move but slowly. But I think our direct experience is that firms have gone into a kind of shock at the moment, and they are much more concerned with short-term firefighting, damage limitation. You know, you mentioned hair. My sister's a hairdresser, and I should be sending her food parcels soon, no doubt, because she's got no business. So I think there's a sort of the expression in English is rabbit in the headlights moment where everyone's going, right, put innovations for the future, right, not for now. And so part of our battle is to bring innovation back onto the table for now. So that's the first thing, is a sort of shock factor. The second is government agencies have a particularly strong and important role at the moment, because I mean, although half of our government clients are also in a state of shock, other agencies are being super useful in making sure there are challenges, there are calls, there's activity. And the third thing I would say is that it's not all about the big companies being in shock. I have noticed that small companies, startups, spin-outs, SMEs are really, really trying hard to get business at the moment. And there's never been a better time to engage with a high growth SME, because they will almost literally bite your hand off for a good opportunity, because it's tough out there, right? So that all is bittersweet for open innovation, which is what we do. But that's what we're seeing at the moment. I mean, as an aside, people are also switching their normal methodologies online, which is great fun. So we're learning how to do workshops, crowds obviously online, etc. So there's a sort of tactical shift, but strategically people are kind of stuck at the moment.
Wonderful. All right, that's good context setting, I think, for our segment a little bit later on. And Chenyang, I know you've gone through hurdles and loops and bounds to get in through our technology loophole today. We got you in. Maybe a sense of your own perspective around the pandemic and how it affects kind of your world and the routes into innovation that we're talking about today.
Yes, you know, with the pandemic, one thing is clear: it's like a global cardiac arrest for the entire economy, and the entire economy about to, you know, stall. And what I have been asking is not what will be the new norm or what is changing, the radical new ideas, but rather than examining, you know, this radical shift that the company, you know, people are making, which one will likely to stay and which one will be actually gone, you know, once the, you know, everything's reopened. You know, I think in that area, you know, as the, you know, business we do is require customers. It's a very simple notion, but when customers are shifting massively, you know, right now staying at home, and many business struggle, you know, we heard a bankruptcy, you know, very high profile bankruptcy of name and markers, and just a few days ago, Hertz, and there are more and more, and airlines are struggling. And those are the challenge that will force all the companies, particularly I think traditional industries, where have been thinking, you know, these digital transformation, disruption, and innovation happen very slowly in our industry. And now the pandemic just, make them realize this can happen overnight, truly so. And this is where I think what will stay, one is digital transformation. I think every leader is waking up, and it's no longer urgency. So whether you do that, or you will not make it, after the pandemic. The other one is, the innovation, which is the innovation roots that you mentioned, so important. And I particularly think the open innovation will become a imperative for corporate growth, especially I think on the top one, the partnership, this joint venture, but in particular with startups, because a lot of large company is like a big ship. They don't move very quickly. I think this is where a lot of startups who are offering future-proof, future forwarding technology, and now can be given opportunity by large company, large organization to help them grow. I've seen quite a number of these startups and corporate as I'm advising.
I think that's a great context setter too. I love the makeup of our panel today, because you all come at this topic from a little bit different perspective, either from a capital game, from an open innovation game, or from a client that probably has to deal with a lot of banking and reg tech companies, and just how do we interact with those. I'm going to pass the torch over to Andrea again. I think we're going to tackle this in 3 kind of interview segments, and then we're going to have a round the horn at the end. So Andrea, over to you.
I'd love to introduce to everyone David Rasson. We've already heard a bit from him, but going backwards, now we'll actually introduce him formally. What we think is great is the way he describes himself, which is no nonsensical and authentic general manager with tons of energy and passion for transformation and innovation. And just from the experience I've had knowing David a bit, I can completely vouch for that. We really love the contributions that you've made for ING. You've been there seasoned as an internal person with a lot of P&L responsibility for years, and now you're in an innovation role. So that in and of itself provides a really seasoned view. Many people who have been in a role that's operational or managerial might run away from the innovation job because it's a little bit chaotic, whereas you've taken this tons of energy approach. So first of all, David, tell us what we would like to or need to know about your role, and then we'd like to talk a little bit about your perspective on some of the conversation we've had so far and what really works in routes to innovation. So tell us about your background first that you want to fill in.
Okay, so my job title is quite lengthy, sorry for that. If I can end up in innovation after 25 years in the bank, everybody can do it, so there's hope for everybody, I guess. I think my role is to enable innovation inside ING Belgium and the Netherlands, which is, I think, the biggest business units inside ING. For those who are not that familiar with ING, but I guess most of you are, pan-European bank, about 40 million customers, present retail-wise in 13 countries and wholesale across the globe in 40 countries. And I always use a bit the metaphor to describe my role. We are a bit at the intersection between corporate head of innovation and the business units. And I see myself as the co-driver of a rally car, where the business is in the driver's seat. We only have one pedal, it's full speed ahead, but sometimes we need to intervene. And the reality is painful sometimes that I more feel like a teaching instructor of somebody who starts to drive a car. And I didn't spot any self-driving cars yet in ING, but we're working on it.
So
I'll
interject just for a second, because people are saying we're still having a bit of audio problems. So I'm not sure from your end if there's something to fix or not. If not, I'll do what I like to do during podcasts, which is sort of repeating a bit what you've said. So the thought here is that I like the notion of being in a driver's seat, but only having one foot on a pedal, which is to sort of go. And the idea of you were saying that you have responsibility in Belgium and the Netherlands with a huge market, and also I know because you have a European perspective. People are asking if you have a headset or mic. I want to acknowledge that. We'll do the best very best we can, and if not, I'll do simultaneous translation from English to English, which is comical, but perhaps the right approach. So one of the things that I think is important is, you are at the crux of many different forces within ING. So you have certainly an ear to the customer, an eye to the market, and a lot of internal stakeholders that probably would love to set your priorities for you. So one of the things we're interested in is, how do you juggle that? How do you make sense of what is really the right combination of, something that will work and in delivery and something that is a new input that will be valuable?
We are working on two levels. I think first of all, you need to have a healthy innovation pipeline spread over the different buckets and horizons. And I think if you want to go for the disruptive bets, I think it's more important that those are driven top down. And so how we do that in ING is we have an innovation strategy which is focusing on a few value spaces. Where do we want to put our bets? And that has to do with how big is the market size, what's the disruptive value, and what's the right to play of ING in those value spaces. And then on the other hand, you also need to be close to the pains and gains of your business units. And that's where we help a little bit more with incremental innovation. So there, typically, that's where I do more bottom-up work of being connected with the business unit heads, the insights. So I'm not sure whether the voice was clear, but
yeah. Well, I think I heard it, and I'll repeat just a bit in case the audience had a hard time with this. But I think it's very interesting when you talk about where, figuring out where to place your bets. The notion that the disruptive thinking should come top down, for the leadership and vision, that the disruptive ideas should have buy-in from the top. And also, you talk about some of the metrics being size of the market as one potential metric. And I think, did you say right to play? That's an interesting topic. I wonder if you could define for us, what does ING mean by right to play? What does that mean in terms of picking a route to innovation?
Why do we think the right to play is something to consider? Because you see a lot of companies and verticals now a little bit swimming outside their natural lane. And we call that beyond banking, and utilities companies call that beyond energy, and you can go on. But I do think there is something like your core strength. And banks, that's clear, that's payments, etc. And I think it's important to ask yourself that question: do our customers see ourselves playing a role in that particular area? Because you can invent any crazy idea, but at the end of the day, your customers are going to tell you whether they are going to buy that product or service. And maybe to slightly correct myself on an earlier remark, Andrea, I think, do all the crazy ideas need to come top down in ING? Luckily not. But I do think it's important that the top is giving us some guidance on where they want to put their focus on, because it's not mutually exclusive. I think there are people with crazy ideas from the floor. We are trying to pick their brain by organizing boot camps and all this kind of things. But I do think there needs to be a strategy, because the most important thing about a strategy is probably not what you're going to do, but what you're not going to do. And I know it's often abused, that kind of quote, but I think it's very relevant, because otherwise it ends up in being a mess and doing anything without having a clear line on what you want to achieve.
Well, I have one last question. We talked about a lot of different routes, and you have had enough longevity with ING to have seen different waves of what was popular, what kind of becomes trendy, everyone's doing one approach. What do you think is a solid route to innovation that's really attracting you right now for ING?
Well, I can only talk from my personal experience. The one where I think we have been reasonably successful in, and I think we can be proud of, is in collaborating with startups. I think there are a lot of accelerators all over the place, and they all have a bad reputation because there are too many people in this for the theater part of it, cheap marketing campaign. So that's not why we do this. We try to truly collaborate with startups, and I think it starts with solving a real problem or unlocking a real opportunity for a business owner. And I think the results speak for themselves. I think average results of POCs being turned into commercial contracts after accelerators is something like 15%. That's the figures I hear, 13, 14%. We manage to get up to 50%, which is 5-0.
5-0.
I think that's unprecedented in the market, to be honest. I'm not aware of that many accelerators which are hitting those numbers.
But we would love to hear more. We have 3 spotlights, and then afterwards, we'll also come back and hear your thoughts on some of the topics that that Chenyang and David Simoes-Brown discuss as well. But that's really interesting and something that I think you can be proud of. You know, the notion of 15% in terms of POCs versus 50%, 5-0, is huge. And once again, so much to talk about, but I'll throw it back to you, Sean, and David Simoes-Brown, and then we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah, let's see if I can go forward, not backward here. It's my pleasure to introduce David Simoes-Brown. He's CEO of 100% Open. I love how you term putting the suits and the sneakers together, which I think is really good. I've used t-shirts and suits before, but suits and sneakers go very well. You are a research, can I call you a geek or a nerd?
You can do, a reformed nerd maybe, yeah.
And more on the emotional side, which is great. When you talk about innovation, oftentimes we talk about technology or product breakthroughs, but emotion plays a role here too. So I imagine we'll talk about that. And you've worked in a number of different spots. I will start our little segment together here by being deliberately provocative, David. You run a company called 100% Open. Is it always 100% open? Is it always 100%?
Absolutely. I can show you my profit and loss account if you like. I'm very happy for that to be public knowledge. Yeah, great question. I think what you're asking is about a portfolio approach to innovation. We may be 100% open. It doesn't mean people like David Rasson has to be 100% open, because there are some things best kept as proprietary. There's some things best kept as your own property. There are some things that are so fundamental to your business that you don't really want to be dependent on somebody else delivering that. So I think the question that innovation executives are sort of asking themselves now is, what is the role of open innovation, right? What's the point of it? What type of thing is it good for? So I'm going to stick my neck out, because I know we're just talking amongst us few people, and say that open innovation is probably the best tool for the job in about 30 or 40% of a given pipeline. So the majority of innovation is probably still best served in the old traditional way, closed way. Although I was very surprised to see on your amazing chart earlier that open innovation seems to be, from your research, more prevalent and popular at the incremental end rather than the fundamental end, and that's something I would quite like to challenge a bit later. But yeah, so yeah, we're 100% open. You don't have to be.
Now I know, I mean, as an open innovation advocate, and I think you waded into there, at a very high level, are there types of organizations or companies that you just look at and go, those are traits for being really good, or conversely really bad in terms of applying open innovation routes to their business?
Super question. No, not really. Experience counts, because it's easy to mess it up, and the problem if you're newish or new to open innovation is it's a very public space to fail. So if you have an open innovation challenge and you forget to reward the winners, or if you host a bunch of open workshops and no one comes, or if you've got there's a sort of a bravery hump you have to get over. But once you're over that, I think it's all about developing your own style of open innovation and your own culture of open innovation. So one thing that struck me when I was listening earlier to the conversation is, and also referring back to your kind of mother of all diagrams there, there doesn't seem to be much room for culture. And what what we're finding is that experience of open innovation breeds more acceptance of open innovation, assuming it's successful. And you can't suddenly start being an open innovator in a culture that's traditionally secretive and closed. It's not going to happen, right? So that is the job of an open innovation evangelist within a company, is to find the right role for open innovation where it's going to work and it's going to supplement traditional innovation, and then to be very careful about the cultural signals that you're giving off, and the sort of behaviors, tools, processes, KPIs, all that kind of stuff that go along with it. So I think a cautious and gradual approaching, and working with your HR team, working with the training guys, working with the IT people, looking at it holistically rather than just saying, hey, it's a competition over here. It's more about actually re-engineering a company to be a bit more open, I think.
Maybe that brings me into the next question too, because I've struggled with this myself, David, and you probably face it as well, I imagine. The tension between an edge organization that is doing something on the side over here versus trying to integrate it into everything that we do. Open innovation, if I look at that company that you just talked about figuratively, like the company that's never been open ever before, is a way to get open innovation into that company going through some type of edge kind of company unit or kind of...
In my experience, that's fatal. If things are on the edge, it stays on the edge, and it's very difficult to embrace that internally, because it's always those funny guys over there, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
So in my experience, it's been more successful when people have embraced it as a part of a conscious strategy. So we worked with Lego 10 years ago, and they came to us asking the question, what's the point? Should we be more open? What's the point of that? So it's a lovely question to be asked, and it was asked by the board. And interestingly, what we discovered was there are lots of patches of openness all throughout the organization that weren't necessarily connected up. So the cultural transformation job became much simpler. Sort of, oh, look, here's someone over here who's doing really well. Here's an amazing co-creation website in Japan that's doing really well. And so it becomes a question of storytelling within the organization and helping people understand what it's for and how you've done it. So I don't know whether that answers your question effectively.
It's good enough. Although I did want to recognize your comment from earlier, because we did throw our bingo card up, and you had mentioned open innovation being confined to kind of an incremental innovation universe. So your chance to get some airtime in terms of, no, it's a bigger Pandora's box.
Sorry, no, it's a bigger Pandora's box than that. And well, especially I shouldn't be saying this because I'm supposed to be an expert in open innovation. Well, I am, but it's embracing so many different methodologies at the moment. It's very difficult, actually, I find, to define it. Henry Chesbrough could no doubt have a good go. He wrote a book recently on open innovation in services, for example, where things get a little bit more fluffy. But I would look at accelerators, joint ventures, as well as all the sort of license, all their sorts of collaborative business models, I think, are part of an open innovation attitude and culture. So it's becoming much more mainstream and becoming much more diverse as a bunch. It's not just let's do a challenge anymore. There's a whole bunch of different ways of relating to the outside world and bringing the expertise that you want to your door. I think that's so. Yeah, no, it's not, and it can be about radical. I think the case studies of it being incremental are easier to find and faster. So there are very few examples of large companies really pivoting in a radical way, and it's just the paucity of those examples that bias the data probably. So yeah, it's suitable for anything.
Excellent. And we're going to maybe even have that debate / conversation later on. I'm going to throw the torch back to Andrea, but we're going to bring you back, David, and have a around the horn at the end. So Andrea, over to you, and Chenyang.
Chenyang, there's so much to say about you. I'm going to mention 3, and then I'd love for you to fill in a couple more. So one is that you have a deep background in, I would say, innovating innovation. So you were one of the first people with a very technical background, but also being able to develop what these incubation corporate hybrids were like. I think you were one of really the pioneers in that whole field. And I know now in Silicon Valley, you are sort of the guru of all incubators, as far as I see, for corporate incubation and that whole model. So that's one view that I think is important. The other part of this is that you've also done within corporations, and I want to make sure that you're able to say the names of the corporations, but when you were in Germany with company unnamed that you can name, you know, you had to be that person that bridged research and development, customer emerging needs, untapped opportunities, and cross-industry. So that's a sort of second hat, having been in that role. I guess the two more, one is IEEE and the work that you've done as a fellow, as a contributor in the fields of AI and computer vision, and now in the medical field, where I know you have a lot of interest. And then the fourth, which is the one that we've got up here on the screen as a logo, is the Silicon Valley Future Academy, which is a way of getting other people to learn the basic precepts and some of the cross work with Asia as well. So what did we leave out, and what would you like to underscore in your role with us today in the interview? And thanks for being with us, Chenyang.
Andrea, thank you so much for the kind words and this comprehensive overview of myself. So I would add one thing, you know, I think I'm also a student of innovation. You know, there's just so much to learn and so much innovation on innovation. And so being practitioner of innovation for many years, and also now as evangelist, and, you know, also I teach innovation to, you know, many executive and CEOs in the board and around, you know, all continents. It's really interesting that to see, you know, innovation is no longer people look at as the buzzwords. You know, people like you guys and really looking at the practical innovation with these different routes, and no longer innovation, it was misunderstood as just new ideas, you know, or something kind of interesting to try, or idea challenge, but rather than changes that can bring verifiable results that create value, right? And I think that is really the view we should look at it.
Well, I think it's really great. I would love for you to, people in our future proofing community love examples. Anything that, to me, someone as seasoned as yourself, you know, has there been an example of a route to innovation that worked really well in something that you either led or observed or participated in?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you know, I think before I co-founded the Silicon Valley Future Academy, it's really taking my passion about evangelizing innovation, you know, to a broader corporate around the world, as well as my co-chair, you know, role for the corporate innovator huddles, which is the kind of largest club in the Bay Area of Silicon Valley for corporate innovation and corporate investment. So we have over 300 CEOs, you know, heads of corporate innovation and venture capital outposts and of big companies from all continents. So I've been co-chairing that for 10 years. And so I see a lot of different examples, you know, as David said earlier, many of them may be small changes, you know, small experiments, but they're also changes that does shift the company. I just give one example, you know, because I was with Siemens for a long time, and both run the internal innovation and as well as the Open Innovation Center I headed for 8 years in the Bay Area for creating future technology bets for global Siemens. I give one example. This is something we published already, and so it's not confidential. This is about you know, how do we bring Siemens as a leader in you know, manufacturing automation and digitalization into really the forefront of the edge of innovation. In this case, the entire manufacturing you know, traditional industry is actually being you know, disrupted or interrupted by a variety of technology trends. One of them, you know, is actually the so-called additive manufacturing, which is basically a fancy name of talking 3D printing for industrial application, like printing metals, you know, for gas turbines or jet, you know, or car parts, right? And this is not just printing toys, you know, and for play. And so it's very serious business. And this has been growing very fast, but yet the infrastructure, the tools are missing. And this is where a perfect opportunity for open innovation, because even for a company of a size of Siemens, it's colossal, right? And it's massive. But because this is a new area, and there's so many gaps, right? Whether looking at from technology, from product to service, and even the thinking, the delivery. So this is one area, partnership with experts and organizations from outside, and also your customers and suppliers can help to accelerate. So from the innovation center I headed, we have scouted and basically found particular startups that in that space that have years of experience, and many of them are come from university and professors studying certain area for a long time, and were able to very quickly to sifting through this opportunity and ended up, partner with our Siemens business unit to bring that into the next generation product. Not once, because I really think the open innovation, or new innovation, it's very hard to use one tool to get a big hit at one time. And that's a misnomer. I think still a lot of corporate are making a one big bet, and you see more failure in that space. I really believe it's more big success through 100 bets, right? And so you try different tools, but you need a strategic kind of narrative to unify them together. I think in the 3D printing for industry application, Siemens has that strategy, and everybody contribute to that canvas. And in a few years, we pushed our milepost ahead and leading that space. And that's a big space, and it's still growing.
Well, it's interesting because David Simoes-Brown talked a little about culture, and David Rasson was talking about the ways that you actually have to piece it together to work with startups effectively. And we love that we have this phrase, please don't love your startups to death, where you partner with them, but you're killing them at the same time because of, requirements or time frames or whatever. And now with you talking about this notion of having a strategic narrative, we call it at Futureproofing like a North Star, that you have to have the why well articulated for a lot of these pieces of the puzzle to have the network effect rather than little individual units that are not coordinated or additive, not to have the double edge with additive manufacturing, but additive innovation. You can have something that's network effect innovation when you have, as you're discussing, a strong strategic narrative. You know where to go scouting for these different technologies and players, and you know how to make it so that their contributions are multiplied. And it sounds like a really wonderfully, I would say, mature way for a corporation to incorporate a lot of the elements that most companies, quite frankly, they do it piecemeal. That's what we've observed.
Yes.
So, yeah. So what are your thoughts about, first of all, it's not a small thing. I think I'd also like to hear your perspective and restate the name of this club, the 300 plus leaders who are corporate innovators that you lead. What is the name of it so people can look it up?
Sure. It's Corporate Innovators Huddle. And underneath we have a Corporate Venture Forum and Innovation Executive Forum. So we have been meeting every 2 months for the last 10 years. But it's an invitation club. Yeah. So we learned a lot.
So with that hat on, I'll ask my last question, and then we'll have kind of a round robin. So if you think about people being quite open with each other, I think, the trust of a group that's been together for 10 plus years, and these are corporate people that get together, in a sharing kind of environment. But the notion of corporate venture and where the funds will come from, especially in this crazy time where the economies of different countries are quite frankly, in question, where will the next investment dollars come for something that is, whether it's incremental or larger. So what is the role that corporate venture or corporate funding will play? What are the big themes that we should be aware of that's on the minds of people in the corporate leadership role?
Yeah, one thing, just quick correction, even though it's 10 years club, one thing we see there constant change of our members because and the folks who are leading in the edge are often more mobile for a variety of reasons. And then another thing, before talk about I think the investment, the role of corporate venture, as well as the innovation play, I do want to come back to a topic which David and you mentioned, it's the culture. I think this is really at the core of success of innovation. I mean, in Silicon Valley, we say culture eats strategy for lunch, right? And so if you don't tame the culture, and it's very hard to get success on your innovation. And particularly I see, you know, from my years learning from my peers, is there's many culture impediments in the innovation routes that is causing friction and tending to heat rather than at the end result. And I think at their primary four, you know, culture, you know, impedance mismatch. One obviously is large corporation with small corporation, a very different, you know, way of working together. And then if you don't learn that, that's tough. The other one is more like geographic location. If you're one from Europe, one from Silicon Valley, or one from Asia, and then one in Boston, it could be very challenging, you know, language and country. The third one is more discipline in culture impedance mismatch. I think this may be under, you know, emphasized, but it's equally important. It's more like people from different discipline, you know, whether it's from marketing to sales to technology, and then to legal, and they actually couldn't really get together because they have their career, you know, like the professional, you know, culture as well. The last one actually is a gender, you know, impedance mismatch, and so I think be able to really have a strong innovation is to have all these factors blended in. Actually, surprisingly, you know, I did that. You can blend in that even in a very small innovation team, you know, of 10, 20, and then you have more chance to succeed. And quickly on the corporate venture and innovation is the role. I really see the role is really about exploring edge, and it's making a lot of bets. But the bets that are cheap and they're fast, it's really a more learning role for the corporate. And once you see something you can colonize, then you can bring the big troop in, right? So that's the role. And be able to take a very agile and low cost, but high volume attempts, it's very important. And that's linked to the culture. Finally, I see the big trend in the last few years is linking the investment together with the innovation rather than keep them in silos as in the previous generation of evolution of using these different tools.
Well, this is a perfect segue into my follow-up question with David Rasson. So this is really interesting. I like this notion of places where the cultural impedance mismatch can occur. You talked about large versus small. You talked about geography. You talked about the disciplines. You know, HR and legal might just have different backstories in terms of their values or their language. I mean, their terminology or their metrics. And you talked about gender. David, any of those ring true for you in your experience? Have you felt that there have been friction in trying to make some of this innovation occur?
Yes, they all resonate. I think for me, culture is indeed one of the most important things to solve, especially because natural inertia in big corporates is already high on itself. And then we didn't see financial service, so we hired people not to take risks, in fact. So then we are expecting them to innovate and do crazy things. And I think for me, there are things we can fix because and some of them we did crack, I think, in ING, like protecting ventures by segregated funding, doing them separate from the business. That's all things you can do. But for me, culturally, I think the biggest enemy of innovation inside ING, I hope my colleagues are already enjoying their aperitif in the meantime, not listening. It's the yearly dynamic plan, to be honest, because this is very corporate. So I think, if I correctly informed, it was invented by Mr. Swan, who's associated to one of your famous business schools, MIT. And I think I always make the same stupid joke. Apparently, I'm not sure whether it's true. In the 30s, when he invented this, he also sympathized with the Nazis. And I make the joke that he did even something worse. He invented the yearly budget. And I think, for me, everything which is related to that, performance management, KPIs, yearly budgets, that's really killers for innovation. And I think if we can crack that code, we would make lots of progress.
Great. Well, that is a joke that only people from your side of the Atlantic can tell. And I do think that the idea, for people who might not have heard it, the driver, if you've got this great culture, but you've still got this annual budget that you're stuck with, and or KPIs that are unchangeable, and or kind of, you know, your way of rewarding employees that doesn't change, then those are not going to align, and it doesn't matter how much innovation's happening, it might not work. It might not go all the way across the finish line. David, did you want to add something? Or was that? Yeah, David Simoes-Brown, did you want to add something?
No, I was just agreeing violently with what David was saying.
Well, the way we like to end this is we are at Futureproofing committed to 4 concepts, and it's going to sound like a commercial for 1 second. See, learn, decide, commit. And it used to be in the older days that Sean and I were really into seeing and, you know, really helping people see what's happening and emerging trends. And now we're realizing that if an organization doesn't see fully, you know, with a richness of perspective, and they don't learn quickly enough, you know, they're not caught up with what they need to do, they are having a hard time deciding because 2 different teams are going in opposite directions and think that they have, you know, that they're both going to get there. And committing, which I think is very cultural, you know, the idea that leadership really has internalized the imperative as opposed to the nice to have around innovation. So we really agree with this, this approach that you've taken, which is that how important the culture is, how important it is to have the alignment of the metrics and the activities. So we like learning a lot, and like to end with each of you commenting on something that you've learned from listening to the others, very short, something you've learned, and some piece of advice, you know, something that you would really say, Monday morning, if you want to think really differently about this, and just maybe 1 sentence on, you know, a piece of advice. So it's something you learned and something you'd like to pass on to our Futureproofing group. So Chenyang, you want to start?
Yeah, you know, I think my learning, you know, there's a lot, but again, I already kind of said it. It's really what David said about the cultural side that strike a chord with me. And I think there's a lot more to learn from David, and because he does this for a living. So that's my takeaway from learning. Real quick on my quick comment also. I do think the you know, innovation, particularly open innovation, for years has been more practiced at functional level, which are driven by, you know, function manager, whether it's you know, head of R&D or marketing or etc. But you know, but those are great. But I think that would not make difference, move the needle, in my opinion, for the company. You need to take a strategic approach. You need to have the CEO, the board, to be on board with this and drive this. And then only then you can assemble those hundreds of open innovation bets into a bigger strategic imperative and move the needle, particularly for a company which is more than $10 billion, $100 billion revenue. You know, so that's really my quick comment for the audience.
Well, super insightful. Let's ask David Rasson. What about you? Did you learn anything, and anything you would like to give as quick advice?
Yes. First of all, Chenyang makes me feel good, because if I hear somebody with his tracker saying that he's a permanent student of innovation, then I know I don't need to worry yet about my struggles to keep up to speed with everything going on in the world. That's my learning, and I think maybe something to reflect upon. If you consider working together with startups, and you're working in a corporate, I would ask you to change your mindset, because now typically corporates are choosing startups, and they do that with juries and selection days and pitch days. And I always say to startups, how do you know if you choose the right incumbent? What if the jury would be composed of startups, and the ones that need to pitch are the incumbents? If you approach it with that mindset, I think you would have a better balanced collaboration between the startups and the corporates, which is typically something which is not very well positioned from the start. And this is where typically lots of partnerships go wrong.
Well, I think it's really
practical.
It's really important to talk about this notion of mindset, and just because a company's the bigger one in terms of revenue or size, might not mean that they have all of the best ideas in a setting where it's collaborative, and the ability to let both parties have their say is important. David Simoes-Brown, something you learned and something you'd like to give as advice.
Oh, well, I've learned a lot today. I think I particularly like David's aphorism about strategy is what you don't do, what you leave out rather than what you do. I think that's really smart. And as a lifelong strategist, I'm finding agile working increasingly frustrating because, oh no, those were the objectives yesterday. We've now got some more. And I'm kind of getting around to that, gritting my teeth. And I think if we can help corporates become more agile, if that's not a total contradiction in terms, and one of the ways they're doing that is engaging with startups, then I think they'll be able to cope with COVID situation easier. They'll be able to cope with the variability of the future more easily. My piece of advice, I don't know, that I think I'm becoming increasingly frustrated by the mechanization of accelerators and incubators. So there's a sort of churning the handle mentality about those, and I don't think anyone's being totally honest about their success and their, how much scale up there is post startup. And if I were to try and put my finger on what that is, it occurred to me when I was in Xi'an in southern China, actually, doing a talk there. It's about having a demand-led model of acceleration and incubation, not a supply-led model. And I think that a lot of incubator managers, accelerator managers, or even companies that have private accelerators aren't selfish enough. They're saying, oh, let's incubate a whole bunch of companies. That's good. Well, is it? Is it good? So some sort of hybrid model between a sort of more challenge-led, focused, purposeful acceleration I think it's just a model waiting to happen, and I'd love to see that in soon.
Well, it's wonderful. And I'll do the first round of thanks, and then I'll turn it over to Sean to close us out. This has been an incredible panel. I learned a lot. We had different geographies represented, different perspectives, different scope, different size, different approaches. And I thought that I had my opinions pretty firm about routes to innovation, but I've actually had my mind changed quite a bit. And I think that it's always incredible to have, to still have the ability to keep learning. I think that's what each of you has said, is we're constantly learning this because the context is changing. So Sean, do you want to close us out with the end slides?
Yeah, and I'll just summarize and make a plug for one thing as well. David Simoes-Brown was kind enough to put a culture open organization test in our chat window. So if our listeners are there, and we'll also post that on the final episode, because I think for a group that might have talked hardcore corporate innovation accelerator or whatever, we talked an awful lot about culture, which probably is maybe a future topic for us, Andrea, in terms of this segment. I also caught just matchmaking between your startups and your corporates, just is probably really important in terms of just getting that. I think there's a culture, but also a mindset piece. And I think as much as we've talked routes to innovation, I think talking practices of innovation as well are very closely intertwined with, if you're going to choose a route, you better have your practices in place. So that's certainly what I've learned today. I'm going to dive back into our deck just to wrap up some housekeeping and some stuff in terms of the future. Our next episode of Futureproofing Now is June 9th. We're talking cybersecurity and cyber trust. As much as I thought the pandemic that we're going to have was cyber driven, it wasn't, but it may lurk around the corner. We're going to talk about that and sign up at those different links there. We do have a newsletter that wraps all of this stuff up. It's called the FN Vault. We like to think it's pretty smart. So hopefully jump on at futureproofingnext.com. Myself and Andrea are crazy enough to be launching a book in a pandemic. Please, 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 if you get a chance, Futureproofing Next, coming to good bookstores if they're open, but certainly good online bookstores wherever they're located. We've also come up with a model for transformative leadership in a post-pandemic age, and just getting beyond moving people from 12-foot to 6-foot desks and more about envisioning the future. And we've got a number of other keynotes that we're going to. I want to thank our panelists once again for their time, their energy, their passion, their experience. I love the fact they're all from different geographies, and we've posted your LinkedIns below. Hopefully if they cite this webcast and appear like they aren't sinister or horribly out of scope in terms of what the requests are, my hope is you'll accept them gladly. So that's all for us. I would just like to say that, once again, our continuing search in this post-pandemic age of trying to figure out, what makes sense, we'll hopefully look forward to you in the next episode and in the future. Thank you, everybody.